Chapter 18. Burdens. Sky blinked a couple of times. For me to live in? A buzzing started in her head, and she swallowed hard as she realized what he was saying. This was her worst nightmare, to be cast out. She'd held herself back from even thinking about any feelings for Dylan because of this very thing, and here it was happening anyway. Dylan glanced down at the shoe he scraped along the floor. It'd give everyone more room. We won't get in each other's way so much. And Jesse? What about him? Sky kept her voice calm, but inside a fire flickered and grew. Well, I reckoned he would be with you. He needs you. If this was what you planned on doing, why didn't you just leave me with Tom and Trisha? Sky clenched her teeth as she stared at him. Dylan's head came up. I didn't want you that far away. I can't protect you there. His tone was matter-of-fact. Sky ran a hand down her hip before curling her fingers into a fist. So let me understand this. You come after me when I headed to Ohio and shot down Tom's invitation for Jesse and me to stay there because you didn't want us that far away. Yet now, we are getting into each other's way, and you want me out. Sky slapped her flat hand on the table as fear built, and self-control snapped. Dylan winced, but Sky didn't care. Just when Sky thought she and Jesse were safe, had found a home. She'd been sure this day would never come, that Dylan would never order her gone, yet here they were. Sky tried to check herself. She didn't know enough to keep Jesse alive. Their time on the road proved that. She should be on her knees, begging Dylan to stay instead of working herself up to a boil. But Sky had been that woman before, she wasn't now. This was more than Sky could take. Her frantic mind screamed that Dylan was unfair to put her in this precarious position. She leaned toward him. Sometimes, you try my patience to the very limit. You're worse than that little boy out there. Sky's chair scraped against the kitchen floor as she suddenly stood, then stalked toward the door. Sky muttered as she rounded back on Dylan, her hurt of fear and anger continuing to build. Her voice rose with every word. How did this become about you, and what you want? What about what Jesse wants and needs, or even Wade? What about me? But we don't count? It's just about you? Dylan replied in the only manner he knew when confronted with fury, the way his life trained him to respond. All his pent-up frustration and wrath came pouring out, directly at Sky. He stood so fast, his chair launched across the room, crashing into the wall behind him. One large step brought him to Sky, his fierce face inches from hers. I can't do this friend thing anymore. If that makes it all about me, then fine, that's what it is, but I ain't gonna do it. Sky could feel Dylan's tightly controlled power. His body rigid as he struggled to hold the worst of his anger in check. Taken aback by his aggression, Sky took a step away from him. Her own ire cooled slightly as her clinical side reminded her this was the only way he knew how to respond. Sky wasn't afraid. Dylan would never physically hurt her. Still, this level of fury was more intense than she had thought him capable. Sky released a shaky breath to help calm herself, but found the pain of him trying to get rid of her took over once again. Can't do what, Dylan? Sky asked. What you promised me you would do? Is that done now? You will stick us in that cabin to be rid of us? Dylan's voice turned to ice. I'll still take care of you, but I don't want to see you every day. Color drained from Sky's face, and air rushed from her lungs. Her eyes swept his features as she imagined the days without him, and the full weight of her feelings settled on her. There was no doubt in her mind her refusal to acknowledge her emotions pushed him to this point. A sob broke. What have I done? She thought. Sky entreated him, holding a hand out to him. I'm sorry, Dylan. This is my fault. I thought being friends was better for us, for all of us. Friends. No. What can't you understand? I said, I ain't doing it no more. Now get packed. You want to go to Tom's? That's where I'll take ya. Dylan waved his hand, dismissing her. Dylan. I ain't hearin' ya. Just do what I said. Dylan's unwillingness to listen fired Sky up again. You rude, moronic brute. Fine, I'll just go. I'm sorry we have been such a burden to you. She turned away from him and grabbed her backpack off the floor. Sky pressed her lips together and shoved clothes into it.
Dylan watched her pack, his shoulders tightening with every item she threw in the bag. Before he knew what he was doing, he murmured, "No." Sky stopped for a moment. Hand trembling, she brought it to her forehead. "This is what you want, Dylan. Maybe you're right, maybe it is what we all need." She picked up a shirt and thrust it into her full pack. "I said no." Dylan was aware he was confused, a mess. This is what his feelings for her had brought him to. He needed her gone, he needed her here. Nothing made sense.
Sky paused as Dylan roared the words, her insides chilled. She zipped her case. Dylan reached around her and tore the bag from her hands, throwing it behind him. It sailed across the room, then bumped and crashed to a halt. Sky said nothing but turned to retrieve the backpack. Dylan blocked her. When she tried to go around him, he boxed her between himself and the bed. When Sky attempted a third time, Dylan took a step closer. It was impossible for her to move. "Back up," Sky ordered. "Let me out." Dylan's raw anger exploding in front of her took her back to a place she hadn't been in a long time. It frightened her. Her hands smacked his hard chest. Her bracelets jangled against her arm when she pushed him again. She demanded space. He became an immovable stone.
Dylan's anger blazed, jumbled with several emotions he couldn't name. He didn't like it. He also didn't like her anger. First, Sky hated his suggestion, now she wanted it. She rejected him. Again. Dylan's chest puffed as Sky beat and pushed on it. He was so intent on keeping her here, he didn't see the flash of fear in her eyes. He scraped his shoe the smallest bit forward, throwing her off balance. "Stop packing." He brought 2 fingers to her shoulder and slowly pushed against her. Sky went down in an instant, bouncing once as she landed, then sitting motionless. Her anger seemed to have burned away all her strength, leaving sadness in its place. "Dylan." Sky sounded tired. "What do you want?" Dylan's glare turned into something else, something like longing. He reached for Sky as if appealing on some level his words were unable to reach. Dylan stopped himself. He abruptly turned from her, striding toward the door. Soft and gentle, Sky's voice came to Dylan. His hand stayed on the handle of the front door. "Dylan, what do you want?" Dylan hung his head, uttering a low groan. When he turned back to her, it was not because he wanted to. It was because he had to. Those first words had been a mistake. Dylan had known it the instant they left his lips. The shock on her face had told him. Along with the weeping hole that suddenly appeared in his heart at the thought of Sky leaving him. Hearing the words aloud, Dylan was sure the agony of Sky leaving would be far worse than the pain of seeing her every day. The second she turned her back to him, he'd felt abandoned. Abandonment and Dylan didn't get along well. He had to put a stop to it. Now her soft words made their way to him, asking the question he'd been afraid to ask himself. It took only a second to return to her. Dylan was careful, gentle as he put one hand along her cheek and the other to the small of her back. He tugged her closer. Sky reached up, caressing the back of his neck. This felt right, perfect even. Dylan tipped Sky's face up toward his and poured everything he couldn't say aloud through his gaze. Eyes locked, Sky and Dylan searched each other for the answers they couldn't find inside themselves. Sky's heartbeat thundered below his fingertips as he slid his hand over her neck. His own began to roar along with hers. Sky's surprise quickly turned into acceptance. Her eyes shone as she leaned into Dylan. Sky moved her hand to the top of his arm and pushed herself up to bring her lips closer to his. Everything Dylan wanted was in his arms, yet he still could not trust it. He would rather deal with the situation as it had been than the way it could be. If, after this, she rejected him another time, his heart would not only be missing a piece, it would be entirely broken. If this kiss happened, it might be his undoing, an ending, not a beginning. He needed to leave. No. Softly, as he gave her one last slow stroke. No, we can't. Dylan turned from her, looking over his shoulder once before going out of the cabin door. Sky knelt on the bed, arms wrapped around herself. Tears rolled down her face.